welcome to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Thanks for joining me. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe immediately. It helps me. And also, I like to see the numbers going up. Sounds really narcissistic, that, doesn't it? But I do. I'm so excited that any of you watch this. And I can't believe that I've got over 50,000 people watching me. Wow, thank you very much. I'm going to do another one today that you asked for. So I keep asking you guys to get in touch with killers or crimes that you want covered. And this has been done by quite a lot of other people. I checked it out and I nearly didn't do it because I thought, you've probably watched lots of people talking about this particular case. But quite a few of you have asked me. So maybe I can give some added value to the information you already know about this particular killer. It is the Green River Killer, Gary Leon Ridgway. And as far as I'm concerned, it is one of the most unreal cases that I've ever looked at. I have watched so much stuff on this particular individual. I've read so many different theories, thoughts, papers, and also listened to his ex-wife talking. So I've really gone to town on trying to get to grips with what formed this individual. Because genuinely, when you look at him, and I've watched his interviews, I've watched him being analysed, I still stand by the fact that he is that person that you would just live next door to and have probably no issues inviting into your home for a cup of tea and a natter. That's the kind of human being that he comes across like. And certainly I think that was one of the big reasons why it did take quite a lot of time to catch him. Obviously, DNA and technology was another reason, but to some degree, there is just something extraordinarily ordinary about this man that helped him to get away with the most prolific serial killings that America has ever seen. So what created him? Well, first of all, he was active basically during the 1980s and the 90s, but most of his killing occurred between 1982 and 1983. So for 2 decades, citizens of King County were literally terrorised by the nation's most prolific serial killer, and I mean terrorised. He actually claims to have killed around 80 women during this time, and that was along Route 99 in South King County, Washington. One of the key markers of this particular human being was that he knew who to target. I've worked in crime reporting for a very long time, and prostitutes are much easier, shall we say, to make disappear than women who are working in normal jobs. I have an issue with the fact that when people talk about prostitutes going missing, they usually refer to them as prostitutes. And that's a problem because these are women who are partners, who are mothers, who are daughters, who are sisters. They are women. The fact that they were also prostitutes doesn't give license for people to come in and murder them. You don't have people, when they're reporting about crime, saying, oh, they were an accountant went missing. But you often hear people saying prostitute went missing. And I think it's a way of us dehumanising women. It makes it more accessible for us to understand, oh, well, it was a prostitute, she kind of asked for it. So I'm really careful when I talk about these things to remind anybody listening to this that every single one of those women were people of meaning to other human beings. Often they'd had difficult lives, but nonetheless they had intrinsic value to this world. But he knew that the chances of these women being missed, at least initially, were low. And that gave him a huge advantage. Ridgway himself actually said, quote, prostitutes were the easiest. I just went from having sex with them to just plain killing them. His words. And the other type of person that he'd actually have sex with would be teenage girls, teenage runaways. There were a lot. In fact, police officers report during the time that Ridgway was killing, the average age on the strip was around 15 years of age, and there was nothing unusual of seeing girls of 13 walking that strip. I mean, how vulnerable were those girls? Life's already dealt them a difficult card if they're homeless and they're pulling tricks at that age. But the idea that they're doing that whilst a serial killer is at large is horrifying, because they don't have the street knowledge. They don't have the credibility of the older women who were working the streets, who knew the kind of tone of the clients. So it was a ripe picking ground for Ridgway. Now, I will say, before we carry on to look at who he was, that he's only ever pled guilty to 48 of the murders. And so we do believe that there were many, many, many more, and obviously they found many more body parts, and there is a belief that there are many victims that remain undiscovered. It would not surprise me. This is one of the most gratuitous serial killing sprees I've ever come across, and I've come across a lot of them. This guy takes the biscuit for relentlessly pursuing his prey. So what formed Gary Ridgway? Well, let's take a look at his life. He was born on the 18th of February 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. When he was 11 years of age, Ridgway and his family moved to King County, Washington. That was the area where most of his victims would be found. He did grow up in a relatively deprived area, so money wasn't something that they had a great deal of. His dad was a bus driver, Thomas Ridgway, and he would often, when he was growing up, go out with his dad. And one of the things that was very resonant, and this is important to note, because I think when we're looking at serial killers, we're always looking at activation opportunities. So let's imagine that somebody is born with a predisposition to kill. So they're predisposed, they have a genetic link, a genetic makeup. For example, the violence gene, and it's there. But it takes certain variables to activate that potential. So as a parent, as a role model, you carry a lot of weight with your child, and the way that you act around them is clearly something that's going to have an impact. One of the things that Gary Ridgway's father would do was he'd talk about the prostitutes when they went down the strip. He would complain about them. He would say that basically they were making a mess of the area. As far as he was concerned, on his bus route, they were an inconvenience. And he was very, very negative about that. Also, it is said that his father would sleep with prostitutes too. So there was this sense of, firstly, complaining about them, deriding who they were, being negative about their existence even, talking about them in a way that's very separate to women, so putting them down, and then using them. That in itself is very confusing, and for Ridgway, that would have been a very difficult thing to hold in his mind. My father hates them, but uses them. Also, we're creating this idea that a prostitute is something to be used. So as opposed to they are a sex worker who has a trade, yes, that trade is their body, and sexual services is what they do to earn their money, but to see them as just an object to be used, particularly for a teenage boy, is going to be confusing, because you're going through all of these very challenging feelings anyway, and sex is a big part of when you get to be a teenager, and when there are these conflicting messages and behaviours around what a prostitute is and what their purpose is for, you can imagine the young Ridgway forming some pretty challenging types of beliefs around prostitutes per se. And remember, most children want to live up to their parents' expectations to some degree. They want to impress them. So taking on some of their perspectives and playing those perspectives out is something that many children would grow up wanting to do. So for Ridgway, that's obviously something that goes completely on the highest volume possible and has catastrophic impacts. But there's something about it starting in those attitudes towards prostitutes through his father. I also think that's probably where his utter hatred of prostitutes was born. Because believe me, Gary Ridgway hated them. They were disgusting in his opinion. They were objects to be used and thrown away. They weren't human beings. His mother was Mary Rita Ridgway. She was a sales clerk, And my God, if we could have a title coming up now, it would say Mummy Issues. Gary Ridgway had the biggest mummy issues. I mean, huge. When it comes down to the reasons behind the crimes, basically, as far as he was concerned, it was all her fault. So again, an activating issue. We've got a very domineering mum who Ridgway said was physically and mentally abusive to him and to his brothers Gregory and Thomas. He said that she belittled him. He was demeaned by her. She made him feel like he was stupid. There was talk of him being sent to a special school. He had this deep level of resentment. Ridgway claimed that as a child and into his early teens, he would actually wash his genitals when he wet the bed. He had a big problem with wetting the bed. But his mother, into his teens, would be cleaning his genitals if he wet the bed. Boundaries. This is not an acceptable way to be around your teenager. I appreciate we all have different ideas subjectively about what makes a good parent, and your child, if they were sick, you would do anything. If they were incapacitated, of course you would. But if a child can walk and go to the toilet by themselves, they can deal with their own genitals, right? It is difficult for a child of that age going into a pubescent young man to actually have a mother breaching those kind of boundaries. It's very unusual. Also, his mother was known in the area, and she was known for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was her overtly sexual dress wear. So Gary Ridgway talked about the fact that a lot of his friends' parents looked like the typical parent. Whereas she was wearing tiny skirts, she would often go into the garden and strip off in a bikini every day after school. And he found the relationship with her very conflicting. She was a mother, but she was this incredibly sexual figure. And again, that activation of some of these variables that leads to this man growing into what would become the most prolific serial killer that America has seen. Now, from a really early age, and I mean really early, he was fantasizing about killing her and having sex with her. Could you get any more conflicted? I want to kill her, but I want to have sex with her. One, totally inappropriate thoughts to be having about a mother. And whilst Freud would have you all believe that it's completely normal for boys to want to sleep with their parent, it's not. Genuinely, I like psychoanalysis, I get it, I think it has some uses. Freud was weird, simple as that. Do I believe that most young men grow up wanting to have sex with their mothers and most young girls grow up wanting to have sex with their fathers? No. Ask yourself, did you ever? Because I certainly didn't, and neither does anybody I know. It's not normal. But Gary Ridgway had those feelings, and he would often stand when he came in from school and he would look out of the window and he would watch us sunbathing. And he'd fantasize in depth about exploring her body and figuring out how to have good sex, because she would be able to educate him. I'm saying all this because I've watched him say these words. So I am going to be quoting things and talking to you about the perspectives from his lips, so to speak, because I wanted to kind of learn about what his perspective was. And he genuinely felt like if she could have just helped him to figure out how to have good sex, that would have stood him in good stead, because he found it really difficult to communicate with girls. He found girls too challenging to connect with. He longed for them. He wanted them. He was desperate to be with them, but he felt alienated and isolated from them. And one of the things that's noted is that his brothers were very athletic, they were very tall, and they were very capable. And I think that there was potentially some jealousy that he felt. He looked at those boys that were his brothers more as jocks and popular, and he didn't necessarily feel that he fitted in to that kind of quotient. One of the ways that he imagined he'd kill her, again, because he's talked about this very openly, is either with his hands or stabbing her with a knife. And he said, I thought about stabbing her in the chest or in the heart, maybe cut her face and chest. So her area of beauty, and also the maternal area, breasts, the very life force that feeds the child. Sexual as well, but that connection The breasts are definitely mother-child. And what is he saying here? That he struggles to some degree with the sexuality of an individual that's meant to be nurturing. That certainly seems to have created some kind of conflict. And he was so angry throughout his life, throughout his whole life towards his mother. He genuinely feels like she treated him really badly. He felt that whenever she could, she would use him as a butt of a joke, that he was constantly made to feel small by her, and that she never saw anything positive in him. And that rage started to really fester within him. And that's when he started taking out his frustrations on animals. So he started to kill birds, and he also started to kill cats with a BB gun, and he hurt dogs as well. So stereotypically, we can say, at this point, he's certainly starting to show some pretty strange behaviour, and arguably is fitting certain variables regarding psychopathy, particularly in regards to hurting animals. Not all psychopaths do that. It is a stereotypical behaviour that we expect to see in certain people, but he seems to be playing it out at this point where he's got sexual fantasies that are violent, and he's also now harming real life beings. So we have a cooking pot of possibility where problems are potentially going to occur. Gary Ridgway even recalls when he was 14 in 1963, he stabbed a 6-year-old boy. He took him into some bushes and he stabbed him. Now, why did he stab him? He says that he did it because he wanted to feel that power. He did it to kill him, actually. He wasn't sophisticated. He wasn't organised at this point. This was something that he couldn't control. There was a compulsion. He wanted to feel the power, but he didn't plan it that effectively. He's very lucky that one, the boy didn't die, and secondly, there weren't repercussions for him. But when he was doing it, he felt like he was doing that to his mother. And he doesn't even know what happened to the boy. He ran off clutching his sides, and even though authorities later managed to trace the victim of the stabbing, that was 30 years after the event. Can you imagine that? So the authorities, when all of this came out, wanted to find the person that he'd stabbed, because Gary Ridgway talks about it in his confessions. So they went out of their way and managed to actually track him down. And his victim said, "I asked him why he killed me. I saw all the blood pumping out of me. It was already running down my leg, into my boots. With every heartbeat, it was just pumping out. It was the whole front of my shirt. It was soaked." And he started laughing. And he had a smile on his face. And he stood there for a minute. And he had his knife in his hand. And I didn't want him to stab me again, but he reached towards me and he just wiped the knife off both sides of the blade. So he wiped it once across my shoulder and twice across my shoulder on the other side of the blade, folded the knife back up, and he says, "I always wanted to know what it felt like to kill somebody." 14 years old. He picks a 6-year-old defenseless child, and come on, we all know how tiny 6-year-old kids are. And not only does he stab him, he enjoys it, and he then wipes the blade and then tells him that he'd always wanted to kill somebody. We are now in territory of real problematic behaviour that has escalated to a point where really Gary Ridgway ideally could have been apprehended at this point and dealt with by the system, because this is a dangerous boy about to blow up, to explode into a very dangerous adult human being. At school, he was a really poor learner and he had a very low IQ, around 80, that is really low. And he had to repeat a year before he actually graduated. So school was not easy for him. He did suffer from bullying, he did feel excluded by peers, and he certainly didn't do well academically. With an IQ of 80, you're not going to be able to thrive. So it was not a good experience for him, and his brothers did well. So we see, again, there is a comparison going on at home. And also it's worth mentioning that his teachers, who did remember him as quite a quiet guy, you know, they didn't necessarily think he stood out, but they did remember his mother, because when she went to the parents' evenings, they used to say that she dressed inappropriately. Now, don't get me wrong, It's not for any of us to judge what a woman wears. Hell, wear a tiny leopard skin mini dress for your kids' parents' evening. You have a right to do that. But the fact that the teachers noticed this, it might have been quite difficult for Gary Ridgway, who also felt at that time that he didn't fit in, to have this sex bomb mother that people maybe sexualized as he was also sexualizing at that moment in time. Gary Ridgway also stalked his peers in elementary school. Part of serial killer behavior is stalking. He would actually follow them home, feeling really sexually aroused by it. He said, I'd have a hard-on and think of the woman as a goal and be on the opposite side of the street and find out where she lived. I mean, we are up to him being a relatively young teenager. He's stabbed a child and nearly killed them. He's having sexual fantasies about killing his mother and having sex with her. And he's stalking potential victims. Remember, part of the serial killer phase is to firstly trawl and then stalk before pouncing. So he's playing out some pretty high-level criminal behavior at this point. It's unsurprising what's going to come next, isn't it? So after finally graduating from high school, he joins the Navy at 18. He does serve for 2 years in Vietnam on a supply ship. And he's remembered by his friends really nicely. They talk about the fact that he was a really nice guy. One of his friends said that, he was a little bit younger and he really looked up to Gary. He felt that he was somebody that he could confide in, that he liked to spend time with, and he was a connection that he really relied on. He had great respect for him. During that time, however, they went to the Philippines. And I know what you're thinking straight away. Nice scenery. No, you're not. You're not. We all know what we're thinking about when I say, during the time he was in the Navy, he went to the Philippines. First thing you're going to think about is easy access to prostitutes. It's a huge sex industry. Don't even get me started on how bad things are in those countries regarding prostitutes and child prostitution. It's a whole other YouTube video, that. But nonetheless, this is a situation where women needed to make money. When the Navy came in, it made sense, therefore, that they would have access to men and money, and they needed it to eat. So he would have had rich pickings there. Also, it's worth noting that he got gonorrhea and numerous other sexual transmitted diseases whilst he was out there, chlamydia, and so on and so forth. He didn't learn from his mistakes. However, the fact that he got sick because of those situations probably upped the ante regarding his rage towards prostitutes. He wouldn't see himself as the one causing that problem. No way would Gary Ridgway take responsibility for that. He would see the prostitutes as dirty, disease-inflicting whores. That's how he would see them. And I think that, again, that resentment that he'd feel because they had dirtied him would be another activating factor into what behaviour that we see plays out. On the surface, if you don't know any of that stuff I've just said, if you don't know all the weird fantasies that I've just talked about, he just seemed like Mr. Regular. He held down the same job, painting trucks, for 30 years. 30 years. Think about that. Going into work every day, often 2 hours earlier because he liked his overtime. 30 years you've worked with him. To have that kind of consistency, it shows you what an organised offender he was. And when we look at serial killers, it tends to be the disorganised and the organised. They fit into those categories. Gary Ridgway does fit into the organised serial killer. Even though some of his work is sloppy, that's more to do with the time frame that we're dealing with. You have to remember, you have to be super organised these days if you want to go and kill people, because there is so much CCTV and forensics are shit hot. So if you are going to kill somebody these days, it's nearly impossible to get away with it, even if it's a random killing. But back in the day, when they weren't thinking about forensics and this wasn't about DNA and it was a lot looser, as long as you were organised in the way that you did the killing, as long as you knew the kind of people that you wanted to pick up and where to dump them and so on and so forth, you had a much better chance of getting away with it, particularly in an area where Gary Ridgway grew up and was living. So 30 years shows you that an organised offender can have good relationships, can hold down jobs, doesn't have necessarily any issues regarding mental health or addiction, so can fit in perfectly in our neighbourhoods. Could be living next door to you right now. It's worth watching some of the interviews with Gary Ridgway because you will genuinely go, oh my God, I could genuinely have just chatted to this guy in the supermarket and it would never have struck me. And that's hard to admit, that I think that even on an intuition level, I would not have thought that this man was capable. When you look at him and you think about him on paper, he was married 3 times, yes, so he wasn't brilliant at relationships, but 30 years he was in that job. It says something about his consistency and his steadfastness, and it says something about his ability to hold things down. That isn't chaotic, that's organised. He was married 3 times in his life, but to be fair, the first 2 relationships that broke down were less about him wanting them to and more about the others wanting to get out of the relationship. His 3rd marriage was actually a really happy one. Really happy. Also massively coincides with why the slowing down of serial killing occurs. What we know about serial killers is they tend to attack when they are stressed or humiliated or going through a period of feeling unsettled. When they are happy, so for example in a really good relationship, there are long periods often where they don't attack at all. You can see that with Ted Bundy, you can see that with BTK. It seems that when they get to a place where there is emotional satisfaction, for a period of time, it reduces the capacity of killing. And it was this display of normality that really would help him evade capture for so long. His first marriage was to Claudia Barrows. That was his high school girlfriend. That was shortly before his departure to Vietnam. It lasted about a year. Both of them were unfaithful. Gary Ridgway struggles to be faithful. He has an incessant desire for sex. It's insatiable. His second marriage is to Marcia Wilmslow, and that doesn't last long again, but that's because he's unfaithful, and he does manage to have a son. Now, that son, later on, becomes an unwitting pawn in his father's heinous crimes. So this boy, Matthew, is basically used by Gary Ridgway to allay fears, would you have it, of his victims. Like I said, we all have these stereotypes, don't we? What a serial killer would look like, what they'd speak like, how they'd act. We don't expect that a serial killer can be working a good job, living a life with a partner, being a dad to a young child. That doesn't fit the MO, does it? We think they're going to stand out. It'll be difficult for them to have relationships. They'll be more sociopathic, hidden away. But no, Gary Ridgway passed for every average guy you could ever have imagined in your life. Now, Marcia said that one of the things that bothered her about the relationship was because of this insatiable sexual appetite and the fact that he also wanted to constantly have sex outdoors. It was constant. He wanted to do bondage. It really wasn't her thing. And he would often be gone loads during the evenings for long periods of time. What she also said was sometimes he'd come in and he'd be really dirty and wet. It'd be late, he'd be out for long periods during the evening, and he'd return dishevelled and wet and dirty. But he wouldn't explain himself. Now, I don't know about you lot, just imagining myself in that situation. I know that loads of you will be like, wouldn't have happened in my house. It'd be like, I'd have got a chair that had been tied to it if they hadn't told me why. Because that in itself says there is something really suspicious, isn't there? You are a car sprayer. Why are you wet? Why are you dirty? I don't know why people don't ask those questions. But she didn't ask those questions. It just let it go. Personally, if something like that had happened to me and he hadn't have explained, I'd have been like on the phone to the police going, husband keeps coming in really late out of hours, covered in dirt and wet. Are there any people going missing maybe? Any crimes that need solving? That's maybe just my nature, but certainly I would not have let him get away with that. That's not blaming her. It's not her fault. But it's just pick those issues up, early. Also, Gary Ridgway was absolutely, you're going to love this bit, you're going to love it, fanatical about religion, scrupulously studying the Bible, reading it aloud, both at home and at work. It never ceases to amaze me how many people who are high-level criminals who have this huge interest in religion. What is that about? Can somebody explain that to me? It seems to be a theme that a lot of serial killers seems to have faith, which obviously, thou shalt not kill, is quite clear in the Ten Commandments. But I sometimes wonder whether it's to do with that God complex that they have, or whether within them there is this slight level of consciousness that what they're doing is wrong, and there's this desire to atone to God. So if I try really hard, if I work really hard, if I learn about the Bible, if I pray, all these things that I know go against my actions, but if I just try harder, maybe I will be forgiven. Or is it simply a ruse? Because again, who's expecting the Green River serial killer to be a fanatical Bible reader? Doesn't really fit, does it, with the crimes? So it could also have been that he just wants to throw people off the scent. But one of the things that I found with Gary Ridgway and studying him in depth is I do feel there was conflict. I don't always feel that. When I studied BTK, for example, matter of fact, serial killer, no sympathy, no empathy for him. There is something about Gary Ridgway, I've got no empathy or sympathy for what he did, but there is this conflict. I feel this conflict in him, that there is an internal struggle. Not that it forgives him in any way, shape or form, but there is just something in his character that evokes just a tiny bit of pity from me. And I'm not used to having that. It's not what I expected when I started exploring this case. I expected to feel that deep resentment towards him for taking the lives of all those women. But there is just this hint of pity that I feel. He had this hugely voracious sexual appetite. He was constantly seeing prostitutes. And when he was in relationships with women, he was constantly demanding sex. 7, 8 times a day. So his sex drive was unparalleled to some degree. Imagine being a partner and having your partner constantly harass you for sex. And it's not even enough in his relationship because he's going out and having sex with prostitutes all the time. And that shows a disrespect level that's huge for the wife that's involved at this moment in time, because he is putting her at risk of God knows what. We already know that he's been messy with his sexual health, so it's not fair on a relationship level that he thinks it's acceptable to put other people at risk. But he's having sex several times a day when he can, and he's going out having sex with prostitutes, so he's unfaithful all the way throughout. Now, before his murder spree started, he was actually arrested for choking a prostitute in 1980. No further action was taken, and that really annoys me. That really annoys me, because this is when prostitutes are put in a category. If a prostitute is raped or choked or beaten up, there is almost this acceptance. Well, they put themselves in that position. No, they didn't. They put themselves in a position to have sex with somebody. That's the position. If you're working in a bar and you're serving a drink and then someone glasses you in the face, people don't go, well, you were working in a bar. What can you expect? But a violent person glassing you in the face. No, and the police would take it really seriously, and instantaneously that person would be done for assault, rightfully so. But no, Gary Ridgway can violently choke a prostitute and the police can drop it. That in itself shows you how women are treated in those circumstances. And that's an ominous precedent, isn't it, for what was to come. He was also arrested for soliciting a prostitute. That prostitute was indeed an undercover police officer. I always think that would be really awkward, wouldn't it? bang to rights in that moment, aren't you? She's like the worst feeling. Oh, can't get away with this. I've just literally propositioned an officer and suggested what I want to do with her. So we know that Ridgway per se has been in his killing career responsible for so many victims. And the problem is that when he recounts the victims, unlike certain people, bring in BTK again, the bind, torture, kill killer, he had a very clear memory for every single victim. Ridgway's not like that. He can't really remember how many and who he killed. That was how voracious his appetite was for murder. He does claim to have killed a boy when he was a teenager while swimming. He said that he wrapped his legs around him and held him beneath the surface until he drowned. That was never substantiated. But I ask you this, if this man could kill, going on 100 people probably, if he could stab a 6-year-old, why would he recall that unless it was true? And imagine that horror. You know, a child out swimming and then somebody wraps their legs around you and holds you beneath the surface until they drown. That in itself means that before he grew into a young adult, he'd killed, or at least tried to kill, 2 people. Now, authorities do believe that his first victim may have been a 16-year-old prostitute whose body was found in Green River after she went missing from a foster home. What was really sad about this particular death is there was a sliding doors moment. Her sister, who she'd been visiting, she'd actually gone home to spend some time with the family. She'd kind of gone off the rails. It had been really difficult for her, but she was getting her life back together. And so she'd spent time with her sister. And her sister had said, you know, don't go. You don't need to hitch. Wait till later on, eat with us. But she'd insisted on going. And that was the last time her sister ever saw her. You just wonder, don't you, if she had managed to convince her to stay, she would never have died. At this point, more and more bodies begin turning up, all dumped in the same river. And I mean dumped. So this person isn't going out of their way to really disguise the bodies. You know, they're just under the surface. One of the people who found one of the bodies, they were fishing and it looked like the girl was waving at him because the ripple of the current was just taking her hand and making it do that. So this was not sophisticated removing of evidence. You know, they were going to get found. The thing is that Gary didn't care whether they were found or otherwise. They were just objects to be disposed of. So now we've got lots and lots of bodies, and we're talking 3, 4, 5 at the same time turning up. The police know they've got a serial killer. And that's when they call him the Green River Killer. It's also the point where they set up the Green River Task Force because they know they've got a predator. They know that there is somebody killing prostitutes. And I don't just mean one occasionally. We're talking the body count is getting big. And it's not long before Gary Ridgway is on the radar. In 1983, Gary Ridgway is questioned about the disappearance of a prostitute, Marie Malva. She was seen getting into his truck. So she's actually noticed getting into his truck. It's really frustrating. You know, the police have seen this girl who's gone missing during a period of time where bodies are turning up, and he's been seen with her. You know, they've got a witness. Police have basically let a monster slip through the fingers. Now, he did remain a suspect all the way through the entire investigation, so it wasn't that they ever dropped him from that. He was always a person of interest, but they had these moments where he could have been prevented from doing any more killing. And ironically, because people at work knew that he'd been taken in by the police, they actually nicknamed him the Green River Gary. Can you believe that? His friends at work called him Green River Gary. That must have enthralled him. We know a lot about serial killers' mindsets. They enjoy notoriety. Imagine him thinking to himself, little do they know, just every day, them joking about that. And all the while, he was. And even worse, when you start looking at the due diligence of this case when they pieced it together. He was absent from work on every occasion that a suspected victim of the Green River killing went missing. Every occasion. But this is going to blow your mind. It blew my mind. He was taken in twice to do a lie detector test. Twice. Particularly in relation to Marie's disappearance. He passed it both times. That's because, as far as Gary Ridgway is concerned, he is doing nothing wrong. When you do a polygraph test, it notes things like sweat and heart rate and so on and so forth. Didn't bat an eyelid. The police said he was very cool, calm and collected. Didn't seem to be guilty. Certainly didn't stress. And he passed. So now he's in a situation where arguably he's got evidence to say that he's clearly innocent. And it would throw the police off, wouldn't it? If somebody can pass a lie detector test twice, you would imagine that they were innocent. What does that say about the way that Gary Ridgway felt? Is it that he was able to completely compartmentalise that part of who he was? So he was only the Green River killer when he was killing. Is it possible that he literally placed the Green River killer in a box in his brain, and when he went to the police, he was just good old Gary, working at his local spray place, nice guy? Because it is astonishing that psychopathy is so great that it would merely be that he had absolutely no care, compassion or concern about his actions. It could be. It could absolutely be that. But I wonder whether there is that compartmentalisation. Because, as I say, astonishing that he got away with it twice. I would fail a lie detector test now for something that I was completely innocent of. I am that kind of person. I am the person who gets in a car, and if the police stop me to do a breathalyzer, even if I haven't got a drink in me, I would somehow believe that I did. I always have that guilt complex. I know loads of you will feel it as well. If I was told, you've got to tell the truth, I'd instantly think I was lying about something. My brain just goes that way. So arguably, I'm the perfect person to get in if you want somebody to seem guilty for some kind of crime. They'd be like, did you do it? No. And my heart would be going so fast, it'd be like, yes, I definitely did it. You should definitely do me for the armed robbery that I wasn't involved in. Now, adding to that lie detector, they did a search of Ridgway's home, and again, they uncovered absolutely nothing. There was nothing that linked him to the killings. There was no ropes, there was no carpet fibres, there was no plastic tarps. Nothing could be forensically linked. They did take samples of his hair and saliva in 1987. That was so important because to some degree, that's how in the end they managed to apprehend him. So they are doing their work, but it shows you that at this moment in time, Gary genuinely manages to compartmentalise his killing from his real life, from his living life with his partner. And his third wife, if you listen to her, she said he was the kindest, calmest, most thoughtful person that she'd ever met. It was love at first sight for her. They met in a bar. He came over and asked her to dance to some country music. They fell helplessly and hopelessly in love. One of the things that she notes about him, he was one of the most organised people, pretty important for the things he was going to do. But one of the things that he'd constantly do was stick to this routine every single day, and she loved it. She loved the routine. It made her feel safe. It made her feel like her life had a certain value. It ticked over in a way that made sense to her. And he was wonderful to her, literally wonderful. She says they didn't ever argue. They just had this calm, loving relationship. So now the police have got 2 lie detector tests that he passed. They've got no DNA. They have stored the DNA, but still, essentially, they've got no leads. And even though there was semen left in the bodies of the victims, they couldn't get a match for it. So he really is getting away with murder. His MO was always the same. So his modus operandi was Always the same, played it out every single time. Abduction, rape, strangulation, and then the bodies would be dumped in the Green River or remote woodland. Ridgway also said that the way that he would do it is he'd pick up a prostitute. Gary Ridgway managed to kill his victims by, first of all, picking them up, but then getting them in the back of his truck, or he also used to take them back to his house. But the main thing when he had sex was he needed to get behind them. So he'd want to try doggy position, essentially, because that's how he could choke them. So that was his constant MO. It was always the same. And Gary Ridgway actually says that he was not a serial rapist, he was a serial killer. He always wanted to define that. No, actually, Gary, you were not just a serial killer. You weren't. I'm sorry, I think we can all agree you were not just a serial killer, you were a serial rapist and killer. Now, I don't know why he said that, but I'm going to believe that because he picked up prostitutes, he's saying that because they were selling sexual services and he picked them up for that purpose, he is not therefore guilty of rape. He's just guilty of killing. See how he minimises? Well, I didn't rape them. And that's what they were there for. But no, Gary, you were definitely a serial rapist and a serial killer. Gary Ridgway would be classified as an Ephebrophile. Obviously, a lot of us would also refer to him as a paedophile, because if you're sleeping with girls under the age of 16, then you are essentially a child molester. But he's categorised as an Ephebrophile because of the fact that they were younger women, typically in their late teens. So he would sleep with young girls of 16, 15, if he could pick them up. But essentially 16, 17, 18 were his major target group. And the reason for that is because they were far more naive. In fact, he says, and I will quote him, I talked to them before I had sex with them, and she'd say, I've only done this a few times before. I mean, if she's 13 or 14 years old, you figure that's true. The young ones stood out more when they talked, when they were dying. Don't even know what to say about that. The young ones stood out more when they talked, when they were dying. Is it because the older prostitutes almost had this acceptance of possibility and therefore they spent their time struggling and fighting? Is it that the younger ones taught trying to beg for their life because they were naive and believed that there was a way that this person would take pity on them? I don't know. But what a horrific thing to say. He also used to select women, ideally, who were white. That was his preference. He did kill African American women, he did kill Asian women, and in his words again, and apologies if this sounds racist in any way, shape or form, I'm just going to quote his words because it adds to the horror of the kind of human that he was. It adds to the superiority, the arrogance that he had in his belief systems. He said, I'd much rather have white, but black was fine. It's just garbage, just something to screw and kill her and dump her. His words. Unbelievable, right? Just something to screw and kill her and dump her. When he's given his confession, he also, after a period of time, because initially he doesn't talk, but then he just can't stop talking, he claims that he'll spend hours patrolling areas and carefully selecting his victims. And he did it in quite a lot of clever ways. So first of all, he might pretend that he was working on his truck because he didn't want to arouse suspicion. He didn't want people to notice him. And to get the girls in, he had some pretty clever ruses because remember, young women know that there is a killer on the loose. They are smart in the fact that they're aware that they have to be extra cautious at this moment in time. So if they don't just want to get in on the trust basis, they're going to ask for some kind of ID, aren't they? So many of them would say, let me see some ID, let me see driving license. So what he would do was he'd get his driving license out and he'd cover his name, but he'd also make sure that on the opposite side, there was a picture of his son alongside his license. And it's ridiculous, isn't it? But us women, we are really easy to manipulate where children are concerned. We have this belief system that if it's the guy with a child, he couldn't possibly be bad. Surely, if there's a picture of him with a nice family photo, that says something about this guy being a loving, loyal human being. I don't have to worry about it in the same way that I would do if he didn't have that. Again, it goes against the reality of psychology when you're actually analytical and work that through, because he's picking up a prostitute, right? So if he is a family man, he's not, is he? Because he's having sex with random women. But it's enough to lower those defenses. Other times, he'd even leave his son's toys in his car so that he could give this idea that he was a family man. And on one occasion, he actually talks about this in his interviews. He picked up a prostitute whilst his son was in the car, and he took her to a remote location and killed her. You think about the relationship he had with his dad, the willingness to converse about prostitutes to him at a young age. So there's a boundary being crossed. He's obviously pushed that further by actually picking up a prostitute and then killing her. But his father was the person who set the store, wasn't he? His father was the person who introduced prostitutes into Gary Ridgway's world and broke the boundaries that should have been there. It is your job and duty as a parent to protect your child. The fact that Gary Ridgway continues that behaviour and pushes it further, still, in my opinion, the responsibility lies with his father. Other ruses that he used were to offer to help his victims in some way, to lend them his truck, to offer them food, to get the trust of his victims. He wanted to make it seem like he was a good guy. Now, ideally, when he wasn't in a situation where he was married, he'd take his victims to his home. He'd have dates with them, shall we say. He'd make them feel safe, make them feel that it was okay. And then once their defences were down, he'd kill them. Usually, these defences would come down when they saw the fact that in his home, his son's room was there. Yes, he was divorced, but he had a room that was his son's. So these women thought he was an absolute family man. He had the same typical behaviour and ritual when it came down to them coming back to his house. He'd get his victim to undress, he'd request oral sex, and then he'd request intercourse. Exactly the same method to carry out the kill. He'd have sex with them, as I said, doggy style, and then he'd wait for the opportunity when they raised the head to wrap his arm around them, or he'd get a ligature, maybe a towel or a belt around the throat, and then he'd strangle them. He'd wrap his legs around them to keep them still, to get the neck into the crook of his arm, and he'd apply pressure with the other arm. And sometimes, to finish the victims off, he'd stand on their throats or leave a ligature wrapped around their necks. It's a really gruesome, horrible, and quite long-winded way to die. It's not simple strangling someone. He got better at it. He got good at it. But still, it's a horrible way to go. To make the killings easier, he'd sometimes tell his victims that he'd stop if they didn't struggle. He didn't, of course. He carried on. But when you're in that situation and you're terrified, you'd just be hoping that this is a guy who just has that particular desire to use autoerotic asphyxiation, just gets off strangling somebody and then let them come back. You would hope that, wouldn't you? So these women would stop struggling, but then it would just enable him to kill them more quickly. Bizarrely as well, before he killed the victims, he used to ask them to go to the toilet because he didn't want them to wet themselves when he killed them. It's very normal. You probably all know that. You watch a lot of murder and killing documentaries. But one of the things that happens is if you have a bladder that's half full or full, you do release your bladder when the muscles relax during death or before when you're panicking. It's very normal for victims to defecate and urinate when they're being horribly attacked because it's the most terrifying thing you could imagine. Strangulation was always his chosen method. He felt like it was really less messy than using a knife, and it meant that he disabled the victims as far as being able to scream for help. So even though for most of us the idea of snuffing the life out of somebody that way is unthinkable, for him it was a very effective measure. And he describes strangulation, and the reason for strangulation is because he found it more personal and rewarding. I told you there'd be loads of his words in this because there's so many tapes that you can watch on him. He found it more personal and rewarding. After he's killed the victim, he drives them to one of his dump sites. He had dump sites in forest land, dump sites on the Green River. And to avoid being caught, he dumped the bodies by the roadside, drive further up the road, park his vehicle, return, and then drag the body deeper into the woods. You just sit there thinking, don't you? How did he not get seen? How did people just not see this guy constantly? It was constant. I mean, you are talking about a period of time where it was pretty much every few days, you know? This was massive. And yet he was able to dump bodies by the side of the road, then drag them after parking his car and take them into the woods. Now, he would also usually leave them near a physical landmark, such as a hill or a large tree, because he liked being able to locate them. You know, a lot of serial killers like being able to go back to the victim so they can masturbate over the victim's grave, or actually get parts of the victim dug up and then enjoy the experience that they've killed them and get off on that. That's not uncommon with serial killers. He used to dispose of their clothes, which he described as just rags, to get rid of the evidence. And he'd also take loads of possessions and money, jewellery, things that he could connect back to them. We see that, as you all know, in lots of serial killer cases. They want mementos. It's really important for them. It's the way of them connecting back to the murder. Also, he would do something called clusters, which meant leaving lots of the bodies in certain locations together. So he used to like leaving them together. That's why 2, 3, 4 bodies would be found at one point in the Green River. They were all put in the same location. It's worth noting as well that Mr. Gary Ridgway was not just a serial killer and rapist. No, he was also a necrophiliac. Yeah, Gary Ridgway liked having sex with people who were dead. And as I said, he'd sometimes return to where he dumped his victims so he could have sex with them again and again. Even when the bodies, by his own admission, were covered in maggots. Could you ever get more distasteful? It's not that I think that a serial killer should have standards, I don't. I just think that as a human being, most of us have got a human reaction to rotting flesh and maggots. It is to recoil, it is to avoid, it is to run screaming and tell somebody there's a horribly dead body there. Not Gary Ridgway. He's not put off by the things that you and I would feel are horrific. He's turned on by them. And again, the people that he's having sex with, the dead women's bodies that he's violating, they are not people. They are just holes that he can insert himself into. And defiling those bodies in that way, it just says something about him, doesn't it? There is something totally broken about this human being. On one occasion, he had sex with the corpse of one of his victims whilst his son slept in his truck 30 yards away. Just unbelievable. Unbelievable. After strangling his victims, he'd usually leave them naked, often in poses, usually on their backs with the legs spread in a really unnatural position. And that signature is something that we see with certain serial killers. It's to shock the people who find them. Sometimes it's also to offer people an understanding that they maybe follow the occult. Usually a signature is specific to have an impact on the people who walk in and find the bodies. It wouldn't be the same when they were in the river, because obviously that would be decomposition through the water and they wouldn't be held in any way, shape or form that way. But the ones that were left in the woodland, they were posed in that respect. And it turns out, according to him, that aside from the fact that he wanted to shock people, it was also because he would have a habit of returning to the women to have sex with them again after death. And so he'd force their legs apart and then leave them in that position so that when he returned, it was easier access. That in itself just makes you shudder, doesn't it? That he actually forces the legs apart so that he can have easy access to go and have sex with them again. He did say that he didn't prefer to have sex with dead people, but he recognised that it satisfied his cravings, which meant that he didn't go out and kill other people. He said that it was a simple way of having sex and it was free. So again, we're introduced to this complete disassociation with the reality of what he's doing. On one level, he's acknowledging that by having sex with these dead women, he isn't going out and killing more. But the knowledge that for him, it was just simple and free. Didn't have to pay for it. You know, they're already dead. There is just no recognition that these are women that he's murdered. And even though he says he didn't enjoy it more with dead people, what you also have to argue is necrophilia is very unusual. It's very unusual. To have sex with a dead body is not for most people in any way, shape or form. So the fact that he's going back constantly to have sex with these people who are now dead does suggest that he had an unhealthy interest in necrophilia without a doubt. Also did some really weird stuff. He inserted rocks into the vaginas of a couple of his victims for absolutely no other reason that, according to him, no, they were there. That's why I did it, they were there. For me, it's all about attacking the sexuality of women, putting rocks in their vagina. That's going out of your way to take the area of the body that is very precious. You know, it's where our babies are born. It's how life is created. And to defile that way, I think that again goes back to his mother. You know, the womb area, you know, the nature, the nurture of his upbringing that he has such resentment for, and being able to do things to the area of the body that he sees responsible for creating life or responsible for the over-sexualized nature of his mother, and then attacking it that way is something that he would find satisfying. Ridgway told authorities that during the heights of his killing spree, he would only get around 2 hours sleep a night. Why? Because the rest of the time he's hunting and killing and disposing of his victims' bodies. 2 hours a night. Because everything is about the hunt. Everything is about the kill. That's what he lived for. Believe me, that is what Gary Ridgway lived for. Now, something that's really striking about this case, very striking about this case, is that during the hunt for Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, the authorities were offered help by an unusual candidate for such work. Ted Bundy. Yep. Convicted serial killer on death row. Ted Bundy was like, hey, you need somebody for this job, and that somebody's me. If you need to find a serial killer, the person you need for it is a serial killer. And even though they actually let him get involved, I have to say the reality of that is because the person who let him get involved secretly wanted Ted Bundy to admit to other killings. So that's why they enabled him to connect with this actual situation. They were trying to outsmart Ted Bundy. But it shows you that even Ted Bundy was somebody who was like, this man needs to be stopped. I mean, that's saying something, isn't it? That Ted Bundy, notorious serial killer and rapist, it's like, no, this is going too far even for me. I need to bring this man to justice. And he helped. He helped the police compile a profile of the suspect, and he helped the police to better understand the behaviour of Gary Ridgway. So Bundy actually was the one who correctly asserted that Gary Ridgway was a necrophiliac. He knew it. He knew from his behaviour. I mean, Ted Bundy was a bright chap. Shame that he went down the serial killing murder route, but nonetheless, he was bright. You've got to give him his intelligence. Gary Ridgway isn't bright. Gary Ridgway is almost learning impaired. There's only one known survivor of Ridgway's attack, and she was able to describe what he did to her. He took her to a remote location in the woods, took off his clothes, and she said his face looked white, clammy, cold. His arms and everything was cold, his hands. He was a totally different person, and he made me think that if he did kill me, since he wasn't interested in me sexually before that, he probably would have tried to have intercourse if I was dead. So this surviving victim had that feeling when he was with her that he didn't really seem that interested sexually in her at the point, but that she felt that if he did murder her, that he would want to have sex with her dead body. Imagine being a surviving victim. Just, wow. How lucky was she to get away? I mean, unlucky to be in that situation. No one is lucky to be in that situation. But to actually live to tell the tale. Oh. It wasn't until 2001 when the original investigating officer, Sheriff Dave Reichert, requested that new DNA technology be used to re-examine evidence that a match was made. And that's when Ridgway was finally arrested on November the 30th, 2001. And let me tell you, that was absolutely a blindsiding event for his then wife. She had spent 20 years with this man. And yes, she had been aware that Gary Ridgway had been taken into police custody and a lie detector was done and he passed it. And she fully believed that he was innocent. So she spent her life with this serial killer believing that he was completely innocent. It blew her world to smithereens. She didn't believe it. The police went to her work and told her, and she did not believe it. And believe me, he was very convincing. She didn't believe it, and then he told her not to believe it, and she didn't because she trusted fully her husband, her loving, loyal, kind, considerate, friendly, good husband. Can you imagine what that's like? Can you imagine police officers coming into your work and telling you that the man that you've woken up next to for 20 years, who you love dearly, who's never put a foot wrong, has been brutally murdering women for decades? How do you compute that? At this point, vaginal swabs have been taken from Marcia Chapman, Carol Christensen, and those swabs contained a partial male DNA profile, and that matched Gary Ridgway's, as did some pubic hairs from one of his victims, Opal Mills. Initially, he didn't confess. And his solicitors said, this guy just seemed completely unremarkable. He was an individual that they sat with and had no belief that he killed these women. You know, he admitted he slept with lots of prostitutes. So for them, they were thinking to themselves, well, this is an unassuming man. He's passed lie detector tests. Okay, he has a problem. He's very sexually active with prostitutes. And clearly that means that there could be some evidence because he could have had sex with somebody and then somebody else could have had sex with them and murdered them. So his solicitors are completely on side. And when you watch him and listen to him, it is completely unsurprising that that's the case. Because I think I'd have believed him. His wife believes him. His colleagues believe him. But over time, he begins to confess. And one of the really strange points is that when he starts confessing, you kind of lose sight of Gary Ridgway, the serial rapist and murderer. And it's replaced with Gary Ridgway, the incredibly pleasant, disconcertingly compliant, and very helpful human being. He was incredibly helpful to the police. He was very honest when he was interviewed. He said he hated prostitutes. He wanted to kill as many as he could. Had no problem admitting it. Now, initially Ridgway claimed that he'd often been provoked into murder because of the way that the victims acted. Obviously that was untrue. He also suggested that he would kill when he was frustrated, and those things that angered him would mean that he'd then take it out on his victims. That doesn't surprise me. We see exacerbations in those kind of behaviours in serial killers when they're dealing with stress. So that fits. But I don't buy into the fact that his victims somehow created a situation where they deserve to be murdered. And later he admitted that he'd always planned to kill his victims. It didn't matter what the behaviour was like. It didn't matter what they said, how they acted. Whether they fought, whether they didn't, he wanted to kill them. He also then went back on it and said, actually, it didn't really matter what was happening in my life. Now, even though he said that, I challenge it. Obviously, I appreciate this is Gary Ridgway's own words. This is what he said. He said, actually, I kill people just because I wanted to. So even though he said this, I don't agree. I don't agree at that point, because I think that you can track back that whenever he's happy, there are periods of time that he doesn't kill. And it does transpire that when you look at the offending behaviour, when he was in his third marriage to Judith Mawson, he married her in 1988, because he was happy, he really cut down the killing. So Judith Mawson had this incredible impact on him. He was incredibly happy with her. They were a perfect fit. Some of his friends and some of her friends said when they got married, they were like, oh my God, this couple is the perfect couple. It is a match made in heaven. One of his best friends said that. He was best man at their wedding, held in his backyard. So their friends had given them the backyard, and they were all agreed that it was this beautiful ceremony and that this couple were going to be the perfect couple. And she had a soothing impact on Gary Ridgway. So I don't agree with him saying that the behaviour never changed, he just wanted to kill. I think it definitely had an impact, what was happening in his life. Like I said, he's the only one who knows, but I think if you look at the pattern of killing, you can see that his third marriage was the marriage that made the big difference. They were so in love, really in love. And that had to have quelled Ridgway's murderous tendencies until his arrest, basically. It drastically reduced his kill count during that time. So it's not that you could stop a killer. Gary Ridgway was always going to kill. But the soothing experience of being loved and accepted for himself, and he was, by his wife, definitely had an impact on the way that he felt towards killing. Maybe as well he was getting older. We do see that serial killers, as they get older, particularly over 45, do often reduce their kill experiences. So these things combined with each other could have led to him reducing that kind of action. In 2003, he avoided the death penalty. Why? He was offered a plea deal. So I always find that quite surprising. I don't know whether I would feel that way. I think that if I knew I was going to spend the rest of my life in prison, I think maybe I'd go for the death penalty. Does that sound really bizarre? I just don't think I could spend my life in prison. I really don't. It's just not something that I feel I could manage, but he wanted to. And I guess that's that narcissism, that desire to survive in spite of everything you've done. You know, he still felt entitled to life. So in 2003, he pled guilty to 48 murders. He was given 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. No surprises there, Gary. No surprises that they're not like 48 years and then maybe some parole. Like, no, never getting out, ever. Because this is definitely a human being who is probably one of the most dangerous people to ever walk American soil. Now, as part of that plea deal, Ridgway was actually required to produce a statement acknowledging his responsibility for the crimes. I'm going to read you some excerpts from the statement, okay? These are his words. The judge has asked me to state what I did in my own words that makes me guilty of these crimes. This is my statement. I killed the 48 women listed in the state's second amended information. In most cases, when I murdered these women, I did not know their names. Most of the time, I killed them the first time I met them, and I do not have a good memory for their faces. I killed so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight. I've reviewed information and discovery about each of the murders with my attorneys, and I am positive that I killed each one of the women charged in the second amended information. I killed them all in King County. I killed most of them in my house near Military Road, and I killed a lot of them in my truck, not so far from where I picked them up. I killed some of them outside. I remember leaving each woman's body in the place where she was found. The plan was I wanted to kill as many women I thought were prostitutes as I possibly could. I picked prostitutes as my victims because I hate most prostitutes and I didn't want to pay for sex. I also picked prostitutes as victims because they were easy to pick up without being noticed. I knew they wouldn't be reported missing right away and might never be reported missing. I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught. Another part of my plan was where I put the bodies of these women. Most of the time I took the women's jewellery and their clothes to get rid of any evidence and make them harder to identify. I placed most of the bodies in groups, which I called clusters. I did this because I wanted to keep a track of all the women I killed. I like to drive by the clusters around the county and think about the women I placed there. I usually used a landmark to remember a cluster and the women I placed there. Sometimes I killed and dumped a woman, intending to start a new cluster, and never returned because I thought I might get caught putting more women there. I mean, is it just me? Or is that so matter of fact, it's bizarre? Also, note this, Gary Ridgway could not remember the faces and names or when and who he killed, but he absolutely knew where every single body was. He had a clear memory and connection with where he dumped the bodies. All they were to him were bodies, nothing else. They weren't human beings, they weren't women, they didn't have names, they didn't have faces. They were just garbage to be disposed of. They were objects to be defiled whenever he wanted. There was no connection, that these were living, breathing humans with families, with meaning. And he then went on to describe how he killed each of his victims and what he'd done with their bodies. Now, he was not the sharpest tool in the box, was he? But he did have the forethought to try and throw police off the scent by on occasion moving some of the remains of his victims to other areas. And he said, in King County, Washington, on or about October the 8th, 1982, with premeditated intent to cause her death, I strangled Denise D. Bush to death. I picked her up, planning to kill her. After killing her, I left her body just off a dirt road in the neighbourhood of Riverton. I later transported some of her remains to a place just off the Bull Mountain Road near Tigard, Oregon. I left the remains there with the remains of Shirley Sherrill. I did this in order to throw off police investigators so that I could continue killing prostitutes. So there was organisation there. And whilst he knows the names, that's only because he'd been told the names at this point. He didn't know them at all. So this statement is given after he's been aware of what and who he'd killed. But you can just see he was knowingly trying to throw police off his scent. And carrying on that statement, in King County, Washington, sometime between October 20th, 1982 through April 9th, 1984, note that he doesn't know when, just at some period between these 2 years. He goes on to say, with premeditated intent to cause her death, I strangled Shirley M. Sherrill to death. I picked her up, planning to kill her. After killing her, I left her body off the Auburn Black Diamond Road. Later, I transported her remains to a place just off the Bull Mountain Road near Tigard, Oregon. I left her remains there with the remains of Denise Bush. I did this in order to throw off police investigators so I could continue killing prostitutes. At the time that these confessions were made, Gary Ridgway was America's most prolific serial killer. And the only reason they avoided that death penalty is because he agreed to take the police to the location of all the undiscovered bodies and also to admit to any crimes which he could be linked to via sufficient evidence. He was also told that if he didn't, it's really important to note this, if he didn't show that he was being honest, I know it's really hard to go like that, I say that and I'm like, how honest is a serial killer? But just bear with me. They basically said that they would not give him the death sentence as long as they felt that he was giving them the help that they required, and that if it came to light that he'd lied, if it came to light that he'd withheld evidence, then they would be able to institute the death penalty. So it was in his interest to be honest. He was going down for life, and he also had the threat of being killed if he didn't help the police. So we have to assume that the help that he gave was as honest as possible. But like I said, it's so ironic, isn't it? Because we're talking about somebody who killed like probably nearly 100 people. And also, just to know, a terrifying insight into his dark mind can be glimpsed through a comment to police that he wouldn't confess to crimes that he hadn't committed. He actually said, get this, why? If it isn't mine, because I have pride in what I do, I don't want to take it from anybody else. Basically saying, look, I have pride in the killings that I do. I don't want some poor other serial killer who's murdered somebody efficiently to have me take credit for him. That would really upset me. Absolutely not. I definitely didn't do that. That's somebody else's. You need to find them. This pride, terrifying. The truth is, I think we all know that many of Ridgway's victims are going to remain undiscovered. The murders are going to be unsolved. Ridgway claims that the reason that this is probably likely is he has no idea how many women he actually killed, because there was so many of them, and he killed them pretty much immediately after killing them, and he did it so regularly they just all blurred into one, just prostitutes, just people that he intended to kill, as many as possible. He was prolific, he was sustained, and he was voracious in his appetite, both sexually but also where murder was concerned. Clearly he has a psychopathic nature, there is no doubt about that. And who the women were in this case to Gary Ridgway is just people who weren't important to him. They weren't people, they were objects. They were there to fulfill his dark desires and then be done with. And he says something really chilling that sticks with me. He said, like I said before, they don't mean anything to me. Once I've killed them, I didn't keep it in my memory. I just knew where I dumped them. The women's faces don't mean anything to me. They were just the bodies. If they had a pussy, I'd screw it and that was it. Wow. That's backed up by the fact that in interviews, Ridgway could recall other things in great detail, such as information about the possessions, the jewelry, the mementos that he kept. His memory was incredibly selective. He recalled things that were important to him. The faces and the lives of his victims, they just didn't figure. They didn't compute. To Ridgway, the victims were just objects who after death were his property. He got a thrill from being the only person who knew that they were there. He knew that he'd taken them, abducted them, murdered them, dumped them, and only he knew where they were. Only he knew how their lives had ended. Only he knew the last moments in chilling detail of their last breaths. It's incredible that he got away with it for so many time, that he killed so many people, such a lengthy time frame without being caught. But it comes down to what I said really early on. He was an organised serial killer. He was very, very careful. Despite his low IQ, he was meticulous in the planning of his kills. He never bragged about it. He used multiple dump sites so that he wouldn't be associated with a particular place. Always ensured there were no witnesses, apart from once when he was noticed. But for the most part, there were no witnesses. And if he felt at any point that he'd been compromised, so he thought that somebody had seen him or he thought that things were going wrong, he would basically date the woman, have sex with her, and then give up the idea of murder. This had the added benefit of gaining the women's trust, which meant that he could then go back another time and kill them. So if he did stalk them and he did go after that particular person, when she's had a date with him and it's been okay, going with him again would be something that they would do without thinking. So that meant that he could enjoy the stalking and killing and just elongate it that way. It also meant that people would have seen him with a prostitute at some point and that she would have been seen back on the street. So arguably witnesses would be like, well, no, I've seen Gary Ridgway, but I saw him with her another time and they were fine. So it was a really good way of manipulating the system. If he was injured during an attack, he'd cut her fingernails after he'd killed her. He knew about forensic evidence, even at that point. He also disposed of physical evidence like clothes, and also the jewelry and mementos that he'd keep, he wouldn't keep for very long. So he didn't keep trophies permanently of his kills. One of the things that the police officers said was there was just nothing in his house. It wasn't like there was anything that could connect them. But when you think of other serial killers, they'll often store mementos, so they'll keep them in their home. They like to revisit it. He was more clever than that. The fact that he was willing to take a lie detector test, I mean, that would have completely thrown the police, wouldn't it? But his argument there was, look, all you need to do to pass one is be relaxed. Just chill out when you're answering the questions. He was really cunning in the way that he contaminated his dump sites with random objects brought from other places, cigarette butts, for example. He didn't smoke. Clever though, because when you think about DNA evidence, if you can get a cigarette butt and you can connect it with another person, chances are you're going to have other people who are suspects. But perhaps the main reason he wasn't caught is because Gary Ridgway looked like your average Joe. He absolutely didn't fit the stereotypical profile of a serial killer. At that time, the authorities tended to look for what we know as disorganized killers. They're no more sociopathic, so it's the same sociopath and psychopath, but sociopathic tends to be more on the outskirts, a little bit more of a loner. People would think they were odd, often with anger issues, usually really lengthy criminal record. They weren't used to an organized killer. You know, a man who holds down a relationship, has a job for 30 years. That allowed Gary Ridgway to hide in plain sight. And when he was arrested, honestly, no one believed he could do it. His friends, his family, absolutely convinced he wasn't guilty, convinced there was a mistake. In fact, it turns out that the people who were closest to him, they didn't know him at all. They didn't know Gary Ridgway at all. It's not surprising when you think about it that he remained under the radar for so long, just allowing himself to kill and kill again, because nobody believed it was him. Everyone, including his victims, underestimated him to their cost. Terrifyingly, during interviews, Ridgway's complete lack of empathy for his victims revealed when he claimed, get this, that he was doing the police a favour in dealing with the problem of prostitution. Thanks, Gary. Thank you. You know, we'll put you forward for some services towards the community. He actually said, you can't hurt anybody. You can't stop the problem. I was doing you a favour that you guys couldn't do. I mean, if it's illegal aliens, you take them back to the border and fly them back out there. But if it's a prostitute, you'd arrest them. They're back on the streets as soon as they get bail. They change their name. And you guys had the problem. I had the answer. Delusional beyond belief, but more terrifying than delusional, in fact. You know, Ridgway considered that what he was doing was his career. He felt that what he was doing was a good thing. Killing prostitutes made sense. They were vermin. They needed removing. Now, in court, Ridgway had to read an apology out to the families of his many victims. Bear in mind that he'd had complete lack of empathy, complete lack of remorse throughout the whole investigation. We have to ask ourselves, was the apology actually real? Because for me, it's really questionable. And I don't think for 1 minute that anybody actually believed him. But nonetheless, let's amuse ourselves for a minute with what he said, knowing what we know about his actions. He read out, I'm very sorry for the ladies that were not found. May they rest in peace. They need a better place than where I gave them. I'm sorry for killing these ladies. They had their whole lives ahead of them. I'm sorry for causing so much pain to so many families. Yeah, I mean, as far as apologies goes, that is a pretty limp one, isn't it? It's a bit like, I'm really sorry I broke your window. Sorry, won't do that again. It's a nice window. Sorry. No, you're not. You're not sorry at all because you kicked it through a bloody window. I watched you. It's a classic low accountability, minimising. He's not sorry, is he? If you watch him in court, it's worth doing it. One of the things that the judge got him to have to listen to was the victim impact. And that's pretty amazing because you get these people coming in and saying who those people were, what they meant to them in their life and what he did by taking them away. And there is one man, grey long beard, and he comes in and he basically tells him that he forgives him. And Gary Ridgway breaks down. It's at that point, it's bizarre. This guy that looks a bit like Father Christmas, no offense to him, he just says, there's too much pain. I don't want to hate you. I'm going to forgive you. And it's breathtakingly difficult to watch, because what an amazing human being, meeting destruction, devastation, aggression, violence, murder, with compassion, pity, and forgiveness. Certainly somebody that I could never be, you know, somebody I would aspire to be in that situation, but I don't think I could ever achieve it. I would be the one saying, I hate you, and I hope you die really slowly and really painfully. I have no doubt that that's how I'd be. I know that isn't probably how to get through that situation, but certainly I would be setting him on fire in my head throughout proceedings, and I imagine I'd be doing that throughout my life, and just hoping that one day he'd get out so that I could do something to him, because I think a lot of us feel that need for vengeance, but certainly it's a beautiful thing to watch, because it's such a unique ability to show forgiveness in spite of the horror that Gary Ridgway had instilled in the area, and of course on his poor victims.
Mr. Ridgway, there are people here that hate you. I'm not one of them. You've made it difficult to live up to what I believe, and that is what God says to do, and that's to forgive. You are forgiven, sir.
The good thing is, Gary Ridgway is locked away forever. He's never getting out. I don't think that he has a lot of visitors. Imagine that there's some women who write to him. There's always some women, aren't there, who go out of their way and write weird letters to people. Like, I could change him. No, you couldn't. No, you couldn't. Actually, probably, if you just wanted to marry him, it'd be fine, because it seems like in relationships he was all right. It was just if you happened to be a prostitute that he'd murder you. Nonetheless, that case in itself has been a long one, but I wanted to do it justice. What is mind-blowing about Gary Ridgway is that he was so ordinary. That's what makes him extraordinary, as I've said. It's quite hard when you listen to Gary Ridgway's friends and relatives talking about him, particularly his then wife, because he was the model husband. Who can go from that? One day, you say goodbye to your partner, and you used to kiss her goodbye every morning. She used to look forward to it, and then she used to look forward to him coming back home. And you kiss him goodbye that morning, you go to work, and then by the end of the day, not only are you never going to be physically with your partner again, it turns out that he has murdered probably over 100 women when it comes down to it. We'll never know, but probably. How do you psychologically make the leap from marriage to murderer? Incomprehensible. Before I finish, it's also worth mentioning that throughout the interviews, Gary Ridgway always comes back to one position. He blames his mother. He blames his mum for being over-sexualized, for not giving him what he needed, for dressing inappropriately, for belittling and demeaning him. He constantly believes that she is the root, that she gave him this hatred that he felt, this rage, and he needed to find an outlet, and that sexually provocative side of prostitutes embodied that woman that he hated but also wanted to love. He can't understand that having those incestuous desires was completely unacceptable, completely outside of the realms of what is normal. Because think about that. He was masturbating and fantasizing over his own parents. Gary Ridgway, like I said, is now locked up. But the ramifications of his behaviour, think about how many people were impacted by the Green River Killer. I mean, tens of thousands when you think about the ripples. That one woman belonging to these people, so on and so forth. So many. And I guess that many of the prostitutes who disappeared that he didn't take responsibility for are likely his victims. It's just, truth be told, he didn't care enough to count. He says he wanted to get over 100, but I think he just said whatever he needed to say. What I do know is if he was still out, there'd still be prostitutes going missing on a daily basis. So I hope you found that interesting. It's one that I didn't know about. I hate to admit that. I really didn't know about, but you guys told me that you wanted me to cover it. I hope I've covered it in a way that gives you a little bit of insight that you didn't already know. Like I said, one thing that stays with me, in spite of him being a psychopathic killer with the most treacherous of intent towards his victims, I still have this weird bit of pity for him. I don't know why. Maybe you can express to me how you feel at the end of this and whether you also felt just a tiny little bit of pity for him if you've watched any of the information. Certainly, he had the biggest mummy issues that I've heard of for a long time. And it just shows you, doesn't it? It just shows you that even though we're bringing up our babies, do we ever truly know who they are inside? That's a horrible way to end it, isn't it? I'm sure all of your babies are absolutely wonderful and wouldn't harm a hair on anybody else's head. But look up Gary Ridgway if you've not heard of him, because I promise you, you'll be like, no way has this human being done that. That's how it feels. Join me next time. I hope you've enjoyed. If you have, please will you subscribe? Go on, it takes ages to do these. I sound like I'm begging. I'm not too proud to beg. Subscribe. See you next time.